agenda. We're going to get a COVID update, Ferry Road update, talk about the county property evaluation proposal. And then we were planning on having some discussions around the land conservation goals, but I think some of the folks who requested this item to be on the agenda are asking that it be on the next agenda. So there's a bit more time to work on refining some of the numbers. So if that's okay, we'll defer that to our next briefing meeting. However, I did want to ask if we could add to the agenda some discussion around the idea of the county retaining a lobbyist or government relations firm to work in to represent our county's interest in the General Assembly. So let's add that maybe in place of the land conservation goal, not for any action, but just for kind of commission input. Are there any other items that folks would like to discuss on the agenda today for the briefing?
I'd love to just share a quick update from our early childhood committee. Just take about a minute.
Okay, great. Anything else? Very good. And are there any questions about any items on the agenda for the regular meeting? All right, then let's get started. And we're going to, the COVID update will be first, and Stacey Saunders is here to present this information.
So thank you, Commissioners, for this time today to provide a COVID update. I did just want to remind our community members who are listening in that at our last update on March 15th, we have moved to providing briefings once a month at the first Commissioner's briefing beginning this month. And we'll continue this format for at least 1 to 2 months before moving to no scheduled briefings unless requested from you all. As of yesterday, there have been 52,259 total confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Buncombe County since the pandemic started. Our case rate has remained low and stable for about 3 weeks. You can see that very pronounced peak there of Omicron and then a very precipitous decline, and now we are at very low levels, and for the last 3 weeks have been at a very low level and plateauing, it appears, at a very low level. As of yesterday, the case rate was 40 per 100,000. And as I said, this has not changed significantly for the last 3 weeks. Hospitalizations also remain low and stable. Buncombe County has experienced 552 COVID-19 related deaths, with 3 being added in the previous week. The current community level status for Buncombe County remains green or in the low level. This marks the 3rd week in which Buncombe has been at a low community level. The community recommendations at this time, at this level, are to stay up to date on vaccines and get tested if you have symptoms or an exposure. I did want to note that the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services did successfully transition their COVID-19 dashboard to a weekly update, and that began on March 23rd. North Carolina DHHS has begun to transition their data dashboard to reflect this new phase of the response and has more of a focus on surveillance and monitoring systems while maintaining some of the original components such as the case rate, the hospitalization data, and the vaccination rates. But I will also mention that those original components will begin migrating to a weekly update beginning April 6th, so this week. For more information or to visit the new dashboard, folks can visit covid19.ncdhhs.gov/dashboard to view those changes. So let's talk a little bit about operations as COVID-19 response continues to be integrated into regular operations for local public health. While there's not been much change in the overall proportion of vaccinated amongst the different age groups, each week we do continue to see the total number or the absolute number of vaccinations administered increase. So more than 180,000 individuals have received at least one dose at this time. Over 172,000 have completed their series, and now over 100,000 have received a booster or additional dose. I will also want to remind folks that in the last week, we've also seen the addition of the second booster for those 50 and above and immunocompromised individuals. I did want to share some equity-focused data, particularly around race and ethnicity, that while vaccine rollout has largely been based on age groups, that we've rolled out much of the vaccine based on where you fall into a particular age group. I did want to take a moment to talk about the progress that we've made in the equitable distribution of vaccine. This slide is actually showing the percent of that particular population with at least one dose. So if we look at the first graph, we are seeing vaccine as a function of race. You can see that in the very early months, when much of our efforts and much of the efforts across the state were centered on mass vaccination sites like the one we had at AB Tech, we saw a greater disparity. But as time went on and vaccine providers, including ourselves, began to focus on equitable distribution and going out into communities, out into neighborhoods, working with community organizations and community health workers and with schools, we see that gap begin to narrow between our African American population and our white population. Still not exactly what we would like to see, but as I talk further in the slides about where we are with our mobile team, that is the hope that will continue as we hire our communicable disease and infection prevention mobile team, that we will continue this equity-focused vaccine effort into neighborhoods, into communities, working with community health workers in historically marginalized communities, low-income communities, and rural communities. The second graph is actually showing vaccine as a function of ethnicity. And here we see a very similar start with a disparity between non-Hispanic and Hispanic groups in the early months. But again, as equity-focused efforts began to be implemented and relationships, particularly with groups like the Mexican Consulate and Healthier Together, were established, we see the disparity actually close in this particular group. And actually see a greater proportion of Hispanic population receiving at least one dose compared to non-Hispanic. And as I just mentioned, we do hope to continue to make strides in our equity-focused approach going forward as we establish our mobile team. I did want to mention to you all that those positions have been posted and are now in the hiring phase, so we are very excited to be having that resource be implemented very, very soon. And that will enable us and ensure that we are able to continue this equitable outreach by taking vaccine and many other services that we provide out into communities. And while that team is being hired, we continue to provide services provide vaccine services at 40 Cox within our immunization clinic, which we integrated our COVID vaccine clinic into our immunization clinic several weeks ago. In terms of the testing efforts, the state testing resource StarMed has migrated all of their testing services now over to the Asheville Mall site. In addition, and I wanted to say that began on March 31st, so all of their services are now in one place at the Asheville Mall. I did want to remind everyone that the federal government has announced that households can receive a second round of at-home test kits for free from their federal program. Individuals can visit covid.gov/tests to sign up, and all that is needed is your name and your residential address. And so I just want to take a moment to encourage some of our community organizations, our churches, and other groups to take this opportunity to help households with limited connectivity or internet connection and access, or even limited comfort with technology, to help sign up households who may benefit from having additional at-home tests. And just a reminder for folks that having an at-home test kit is one way to help continue to limit the spread of a virus to others through quick identification and then limiting your contact with others. And as we locally continue to integrate many of the COVID-19 functions, like I mentioned, the vaccine clinic integrating into our immunization clinic, many of those COVID-19 functions are now being integrated into our normal public health operations to reflect our current phase of the response. We have also modified the Ready Team phone line to match that current need and that demand to more fully transition COVID-19 calls into our existing clinic function. You might remember that the Ready Team phone line was established early on in the pandemic. I believe it was around April of 2020 to address community members' questions. Over time, that call volume has decreased. We continue to have Ready Team members on staff that do address COVID-19 questions. They support our communicable disease nurses and assist with COVID-19 vaccine immunizations. But staffing needs have decreased over time, and again, just gradually integrating all of that into our normal public health operations. So we began migrating all calls that were coming into the Ready Line phone line, which is 419-0095, that's the Ready Team line, to our existing 250-5000 beginning March 21st. So if folks were calling the 0095, it was automatically being forwarded over to the 5000, and we were answering those calls and transferring them appropriately to either our immunization clinic or to sometimes our economic services staff, because we were still having folks call about COVID financial assistance. So we do plan to discontinue the use of that extension, the Ready Team phone line, due to the low usage and the low demand, and we plan to discontinue that this week. This means that we will integrate COVID-19 calls into our normal phone operations at extension 5000. Team members, as I said, will transfer folks who call in to the appropriate section, and will retain that 0095 extension and reconnect or reinstate it if COVID response or other responses in the future warrant that. So we'll retain that for future use as part of our preparedness plan. The last operational item I wanted to update you all on is the federal government's recently launched Test to Treat program. I mentioned this briefly in the earlier weeks, but just a reminder, through this program, people are able to get tested, and if they are positive and treatments are appropriate for them, receive a prescription from a healthcare provider and have their prescription filled all in one location. Initially, this program was limited to large retail pharmacies. You might remember we had 3 CVSs in our area that were participating when it initially launched. The program has now expanded in many areas, including ours, to include urgent cares and local pharmacies. So folks can visit the website that I provided on the screen. You can put in your zip code or your city and find a test to treat provider in your area, and you can even set what radius you want it to look for. So as we were testing it out and put in 28801 and just used a 10-mile radius, we have about 6 providers now. If you use other zip codes and say 25 miles, you get up to 8 or 9. So depending on where you are and what radius you want to look for, there are more providers than just the 3 CVSs at this time. And lastly, I did want to mention that Buncombe County HHS provided a Let's Talk Treatment webinar and session last week to provide information about treatment and therapeutics. I do want to thank our own Dr. Jennifer Mullendor, our medical director, for facilitating that Let's Talk session, and our panelists who did talk about their treatment process, which included partners from Mercy Urgent Care, Pardee Infectious Disease, and MAHEC. And it it was very well attended. So as I wrap up things today, I did want to just remind folks and leave folks with just a few things that are going to sound repetitive for good reason. So please be aware of symptoms and exposure to those with COVID-19. Get tested if you have symptoms or have been exposed. If positive and or you have symptoms, stay home and wear a mask around others. If you are high risk for severe illness, please talk to your provider about treatment or check out one of the test to treat providers in our area, and please stay up to date on vaccines. So one last reminder as I close out, that this is National Public Health Week, and our HHS Director, Stoney Blevins, will be acknowledging this week at your regular meeting later this evening. But while I had a moment, I wanted to just express my gratitude and respect for the many public health warriors here in Buncombe County and across our state and nation for the incredible job that they have been doing and continue to do every day. Much of what public health does goes unnoticed daily, but it is vital to our vibrant and growing communities, including ours here. And to all those dedicating themselves to public health service, I want to thank you. Please take a moment this week to think about the ways that public health is important to our communities and to our future. And thank you, commissioners. Happy to answer any questions you have.
I've got a couple, I guess, test to treat questions or clarifications. The GIS link that you sent where you can search by your zip code is awesome, and that's so optimistic. It's kind of like, it just seems like the way out of this, the way to live with this. It doesn't, though, tell a citizen or a patient very well what to do. So I just want to recap. You talk to your doctor first to get tested. You call one of those places on the map, or kind of walk us through briefly what you do if you think you have COVID to do that program.
Sure. So for the test to treat, it can happen a couple of ways. If you take an at-home test and it comes up positive, you can call a test to treat provider and say, I've taken an at-home test, and they'll talk you through stepwise of whether or not they'll accept that at-home test, because some will. Others will say, great, I want you to come in and we'll do an assessment and we'll retest. And then from there, they'll issue the prescription if you are eligible and that's appropriate for your treatment. And then you will be able to fill that prescription right there in the location. So for folks who say, I just have symptoms and I'm not really sure, you can find one of those test to treat providers. You can call ahead and say, I've got really bad symptoms. I want to get tested and if possible, get treatment. And then they'll test you there at the site and again, go through the same process of if you're positive and treatment is appropriate for you, that you'll be issued a prescription at that visit and you'll be able to fill that prescription right then and there. So a one-stop shop.
Okay. Awesome. And in terms of qualifying, I guess right now, because of supplies nationally, you have to be of a certain age or kind of where are we there?
That's right. So there are some criteria that have to be met. I won't go through all of them right here, but the providers at the test to treat locations will be able to assess very quickly whether or not someone is appropriate for treatment. But there are some qualifying criteria that folks will have to meet. Although now the actual supply has increased, so that's good news. And with cases being so low,
Yeah.
it's helpful to still, there's more supply on hand as well.
So in theory, with time and supplies increase, it's available to everyone? Is that kind of the
I'm sorry, can
understanding?
you repeat that?
I was saying, in theory, as time goes on and supplies increase, it would become available to anyone and everyone? Is that generally what people?
That's the hope of, just like any other treatment that would be available for other types of infectious diseases, and think about maybe even flu and having some of that treatment available very quickly upon a positive test. That's the hope.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, any other questions? All right, thank you, Stacy. Appreciate
Thank you all.
All right, next up is the Ferry Road item.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. So tonight, quick update to you on the Ferry Road project. This project, as you know, we've been in our public engagement phase, and so today we want to share with you some initial insights from that, but we will be back in 2 weeks to seek additional input from you, but this is our initial presentation to you. So as background and kind of a request moving into the future, in October of 2021, the Buncombe County staff team began public engagement activities on the Ferry Road project. Purpose of that public engagement was to gather community, organization, and neighborhood input on this project. Using this feedback, staff are asking the board to ultimately make a determination about how you'd like to proceed. And in terms of how you'd like to proceed, we'd like you to narrow it down to a specific scenario, or at least some elements around a base scenario that you think are important for the property. So moving forward, when we return on the 19th, when I return on the 19th, we'll ask for you to formally choose a way ahead. But this is just sort of that initial presentation. As a reminder, I know everyone knows the site, but it's important to refresh for the public. The Ferry Road site, on the left, you can see where that property sits in relation to Brevard Road, the Arboretum, Bent Creek, and also the future Pratt & Whitney workforce training site and employer. Additionally, on the right, you can see the development and suitability analysis, which gives a framework for what could be developed on the site once we approach this from an environmental lens first. So we approached it with a lens of preserving much of the site, the steep slopes, of course, the water courses, the wetlands, things of that nature. So in terms of our public engagement approach, our approach was multi-phased, as you'd expect, but just want to walk through kind of the steps we've been through. One of our key steps was a neighborhood meeting. And this was an in-person meeting that we had to reschedule based on COVID, public health concerns, but we targeted 100 parcels around the Ferry Road site. And so these are important because these are folks that are directly impacted by anything that happens on the site. Some folks in some cases have lived there 68 years adjacent to the property and of course have questions about the future. Additionally, we moved into a stakeholder engagement phase. And so our stakeholders, these are organizations that are likely to have an interest in the property from a variety of perspectives. And so we specifically looked at housing organizations, environmental organizations, recreational and economic development organizations. So examples of who those could be, Mountain Housing, Habitat for Humanity, the Connect Buncombe. Different examples of organizations that might have an interest in where this property sort of moves. Additionally, we opened up to have a community-wide public engagement phase. And so we held a virtual session that was open to anybody that was willing and had folks attend that. And then finally, we had a community survey, again, open to anyone that was willing to complete it. And that's been advertised with our CAPE team for over a month at this point. So lots of different ways to plug people in, but recognizing there's different types of voices in our community. The neighborhood voice directly impacted by this, the organizational voice that may have advocacy or other concerns related to the property, but then just the public at large. Our emphasis throughout this engagement has been, let's make sure we're hearing from impacted folks. Let's hear your interests, but also your concerns. We don't expect there not to be one or both. But additionally, this isn't the end. So we're engaging with you today, but expect us to continue to get back with you, to hear from us in different medium, whether it's email, virtual, or the like. These are examples of some of the tools we use, just to give you examples. On the right, that's our public input platform, which has been excellent. You can see there is a QR code that provides a link to the survey that we distributed, and then a brochure on the left. Just examples of how we're trying to communicate. The public input page, there's a web address at the bottom of the page, just putting it in there for those that haven't seen it. And then a few metrics on the far right, and this is across our different platforms, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or whatever. Over 20,000 impressions, 700 plus engagements, 200 plus clicks. So we're drawing some attention across these different medium using these communication strategies, and just wanted to mention those. Here we have an example of what the community survey looks like. I'm not going to spend much time here, just wanted to include it as a snippet so you get a sense of what that looked like. So, on to the results. The results today we're going to present in those same engagement buckets that I've already presented to you. So the neighborhood, the organizations, and the public at large. We're going to lead with the neighborhood, and here, we've got our key themes. So by no means is this meant to be every single thing that I've heard, but just general concepts that we documented in our neighborhood sessions. So in general, what we heard from the neighborhood was, let's make sure that we're ensuring accountability. Like, it's all good to talk about affordable housing, greenways, et cetera, but how do we make sure that those things are delivered when this site is actually developed? Additionally, folks that live around this property have very practical concerns about buffers and setbacks. This property is literally in my backyard. What are you going to do to ease the transition for me? So very practical concerns. Where I think we spent the majority of our time is on this next section, which is infrastructure. And in general, the questions here are, what are you going to do to improve the existing infrastructure, which in some cases, is narrow, aging bridges, in some cases, blind turns. What are you going to do about that? But also, if you're bringing additional volume, additional density, what are you going to do in terms of new infrastructure? Because the belief of these folks, and I would stand with them on this, the existing infrastructure is insufficient. And specifically, I'm talking about road infrastructure. Additionally, lots of concerns about the density of the development and the impacts of that density, and we find those most commonly related to traffic. Brevard Road in particular, a lot of activity there, so what can we do to impact that? But also impacts to the environment. This is a site that doesn't have any development on it today, so any development will have some type of environmental impact. And we have sought to minimize that through our approach with Equinox to sort of look at conservation first, but we have to continue to acknowledge it. Additionally, looking at stormwater, as you put in different surfaces than what we currently have today. From the housing perspective, a consistent question, let's assess the market. Do we really need certain types of housing stock? And making sure we do that before we sort of begin the development process. One consideration I've heard many times is that there's a lot of density coming to the area, specifically Brevard Road, so do we need more? With that, the final item I'll touch on from the neighborhood perspective is public recreation sounds awesome. We know the French Broad is right here, the Bent Creek, as well as the Arboretum. If there's going to be public recreation opportunities like a greenway, please make sure that it remains clean, is maintained, and is utilized. The word I have on this slide is activated. What we mean is utilized. We want to make sure there's traffic on the greenway. So that's a quick snippet of what we heard from the neighborhood. Again, there's more feedback. I'd be glad to share any of it with you at any time, but these are the key themes. Again, if I would say anything, the primary questions were around infrastructure, but also making sure that we're being considerate of those that have lived there a long time. As we transition to our next slide, we're going to be talking about stakeholder organizations. A lot of words on the slide, I apologize. But on the far left, I want you to see examples of the attendees that participated. Not meant to be comprehensive, but just a reminder, folks like MHO, Habitat, the MPO, the Chamber, Mountain True, Riverlink, Connect Buncombe, Asheville on Bikes, and more. So a good smattering of representatives in our community with different interests. The key themes we're going to touch on today are going to be in housing, recreation, sustainability, and economic development. And I'll just give you a flavor of what we heard. From a housing standpoint, this was echoed loud and clear by just about everybody. As many different types of housing stock as possible. And when I say stock, single family versus multifamily versus missing middle, as much variety as possible. But additionally, as much variety as possible when it comes to affordability. So really stressing the need for mixed incomes. We don't want this to be a place of just certain types of incomes. We want to have the mix where possible. Also an interest of a mix of rental and home ownership. And then some interesting, comments about parking. There was some back and forth on this. There was by no means consensus, but the input was, don't forget about parking. You would, of course, like to use public transportation where possible and bike ped transportation where possible, but the nature of the site lends itself to the need for some car dependency, so don't forget about that. From a recreation perspective, it was unanimous. Let's conserve as much of the site as possible, public parks, waterway access, but begin with those in mind. Don't treat the greenway as an afterthought, think of it on the front end. Also think about how this property interacts with the surrounding communities and linking those where possible. And then the third bullet, consider public transportation where possible, but also the nature of the site and potentially its car dependency. From a sustainability perspective, pretty unanimous as well, water quality. We're right on the French Broad, so let's make sure we take care of that river. But additionally, there's a wetland on the site, and let's make sure that we preserve that as well. There were some suggestions about development style, so looking at potential net zero, LEED, green building, solar as well. And so those were all items that were brought to the table. From an economic development perspective, some considerations around bringing in an employer, if possible, in the light industry or hybrid style, hybrid being sort of a manufacturing plus public-facing component. Remembering that mixed use is attractive to these types of employers, but then also think about the complementary uses like childcare that we don't necessarily talk about from an economic development standpoint, but that are critical to our neighborhoods and communities. So that's some input from the stakeholders. We do plan to re-engage with these folks as we move forward, just like we will with the neighborhood, so I'm sure we'll get evolving thoughts. From the public at large, again, our main means for communicating here was through a virtual session, but also our survey. So a lot of what we're seeing is coming from the survey. So from the site goals perspective, pretty unanimous. Top two goals, folks want to see sustainability is at the top of our view. And so that could be through preservation of the property, it could be through water quality, different ways. Inclusive and affordable housing at 52%, really important to survey participants. Preferred scenarios, concept A was deemed pretty favorable at 60%, B and C kind of coming in right behind it at 40%. Preferred land uses, in general, green space. After that, it was looking at housing and then commercial. And then this final bucket, these are our open or free-form comments. I wanted to include this here because y'all filled out surveys before. We provide questions, and sometimes people don't like the questions you're asking, and they don't want to respond to those necessarily. So they give you comments in free form, and that's okay. So I wanted to make sure we talked about this. A consistent question in the free form was, make sure you consider the neighbors. And so you've heard me say that multiple times, but examples of folks that have lived in this community for a long time. So make sure that as this development proceeds, we don't forget about those folks. So I wanted to make sure I relayed that today. Also, a healthy balance of preserve the site. And preserve the site meaning, create more natural space, but also a healthy contingent of folks that just said leave it as it is. It should just be a park, it should just be natural, that type of thing. Wanted to make sure you heard that. A number of folks even gravitated towards certain scenarios because they said, if I could pick a scenario that said do nothing, I would do that, but absent that, I will give you this scenario, which was concept A. So just wanted to relay that. But then on the inverse of that, a really strong contingent of folks saying create as much housing as possible. So I think we've talked about this since the beginning. We always knew there would be some conflicts between development, preservation, creation of more housing and not. I still think we can achieve many of these goals, but I wanted to make sure you heard it and that we weren't glossing over it. So not quite done, but again, as we move to next steps, we'll be back on the 19th. At that point, I'll be asking for you to narrow it down. What's the kind of base scenario you're interested in, or what are the key elements that you're looking for as we move forward so we can design those with our Equinox team. As we do that, just some things for you to consider. So this is a word cloud. These get a lot of use, but I think it's important to kind of take a look, because if you look at it, the first thing I see in blue is affordable housing. Again, we make the words bigger based on what was most common in the responses to the questions. You can also see in yellow some big questions about traffic. Don't think we should be surprised by that. Over to the right, impact to the local community. But again, housing needs at the top left. So you kind of get a sense, of what was really on the minds of folks as they were responding to the survey. Nothing too surprising for me, but wanted to make sure we shared it. So I'd just like to give you kind of a quick reminder on these scenarios so that you have this in mind as you think about the 19th. So consideration of key elements for this project. What's the appropriate mix of housing types? And again, types meaning single family versus multifamily, missing middle. What is the right mix that we're looking for from the commission level? Is there a role for anchor institutions? Do we want to see an employer or an educator at the property? What's the role of neighborhood services? Do we want to see childcare? Do we want to see clinics, elder care, things of that nature on the site? But also, what's the role of natural space? What's the balance? What do we leave alone and what do we develop? We won't be able to accomplish all of these things, but I do think it is important for commission to have a sense of, what are your priorities as we look at these specific elements. So quickly, the scenarios, and I will not walk you through these in detail. Again, concept A, in this scenario, we have single-family housing and employer, a little bit of multifamily. As we move to concept B, we continue to have single-family, but introduce more missing middle, no multifamily. Concept C, we really begin to create sort of a center, a commercial space for the property. But again, think of commercial not as, drive-through or fast food chains. Think of it more of childcare, clinics, that type of thing. But in this scenario, we have some more multifamily as well as the missing middle. As we move into concept D, we remove single-family housing, really emphasize multifamily, additional commercial, hybrid, residential. Concept E, we really sort of take a complete different page out of the book and focus more on economic development, industrial uses. We've heard from the board on many of these options in the past and know that your interest isn't in concept E as an example, but wanted to make sure that we brought that to the public just so they had an opportunity to see what you saw. So I am done for now, unless you have questions. Again, we will be back on the 19th to hear from you about what you'd like to see in the property. And I'm glad to take any questions now if you have them.
Tim, thank you so much. This was a great reminder as well, particularly of the concepts. I'm curious, as we look at the people who participated in the community-wide meetings and virtual sessions, it says that 41% or more of the respondents live 5 miles or more from the property. Are those folks who participated as stakeholders, or are they folks who participated? Do you know where they're coming from, and how far away from the proposed development site are they?
Sure. Those would be respondents to our survey, so they're not organizations, just the community-wide survey.
Thank you.
And I have a couple of questions. Thank you for all this information. So when I'm looking at this, it kind of looks like from the feedback that concept A, B, and C is where folks are leaning in those. So I just have some specific questions around those. And so, well, first question, it seems like that southern access road, do we know anything more about that? Because that seems like a key component of addressing the infrastructure, especially. That seems to be a big concern. Do you have any input on that at this point?
Sure. Nothing additional to offer today, but we do believe that southern access is critical, especially if the density of the site is increased. And I think in any scenario, candidly, we need better infrastructure on the site, and so that needs to be at the forefront of what we do. So,
Thank you. And then, so looking at those three concepts, when I looked at the number of units they'd bring in, so concept A, and I just kind of took the average of the number. I averaged the numbers that you all had given us before. So looking at concept A, you end up with about 335 total units. 60 to 80 is your estimate on affordable within that. Concept B, 330 total, 60 to 80 affordable. So those two are coming in basically at about the same amount of units. I think the difference there being concept A has all three. It has single-family housing, missing middle, and multifamily. And then concept C comes in around 445, so about 100 more total. And instead of the 60 to 80 affordable, 80 to 100 affordable. So not a huge increase in affordable, but some increase there. And so I just wanted to make sure, is that still kind of where we are with those numbers, what you're thinking?
What I would say, those are ranges that came at a very early stage in the project. We presented this to you, almost 9 months ago at this point. And so any of those land use types can be ratcheted up. So when you look at a concept B and you see single family, you could say, you know what, that really should be missing middle, and we get to see the density increase there. So from the commission perspective, I'd urge you not to don't look at those ranges as finite and finished. There's the opportunity still to influence those based on what your objectives are. So if it's more units, then we ratchet up.
Thank you.
And how did you come up with those percentages for affordability?
It was a rough number used by our housing firm that was on the project team, and they used a 20% number, is what I recall. So
And what was that based on?
that was based on what we've seen from the city of Asheville with some of their recent developments, but not meant to be kind of a final.
But their recommendation is 80% market rate and 20% affordable?
Again, at a very early stage in the process. I think as we move forward, we need to start looking at the pro forma, the financial feasibility of these to really dial in where we're trying to be.
So for myself, I hope we would bring an open mind to a much higher percentage of affordability. If we had 10 to 20% of like all the developments in our community affordable, like that'd be nice, and this would fit in. But like mostly it's zero, right? So I agree we need like a diverse mix of demographics in this neighborhood, but we don't own a lot of property, and the projects we invest in that do affordable housing, it takes millions of dollars. So I just think we need to look at this in terms of how we've set some ambitious goals, and this, if we have 50 acres of buildable land, we need to make sure we take a big step towards meeting a number of those different goals within that. So I'm open to doing more.
Yep.
And I guess one more question, just while we're reflecting on this over these next couple of weeks. So with the retail commercial that you were potentially including in these various ones, so in concept A, it looked like around 60 to 90,000, and I think that was recreation-based. That was square footage. And then concept C was 25 to 40,000. So actually the square footage in concept A was more. Can you speak to that, kind of what the thought process was?
Sure. I think we wanted with concept A, we were looking for a scenario that kind of had an employer that kind of fit the area. This being kind of a recreation destination with Bent Creek and et cetera. So that was the nature of that. But that type of employer, light industry employer, an anchor employer, doesn't necessarily need to be recreation-based or something of that nature. It was more to introduce that kind of concept, if that makes sense. So.
Okay, thank you.
And commissioners, one thing Tim said that I want to point out here is as you look through the concepts, think about what elements you like, and then we can actually design something to pull out the elements that you're looking for. So you don't have to be married to a specific concept, but the elements within the concept. Thanks.
I appreciate that. I mean, in some ways, one of the other recommendations coming forward on that date is going to be to hire DFI, right? To kind of, assuming we don't just make it all into a park, which again, it's not an unappealing idea, don't get me wrong, but considering the housing needs we have in the community, it's not what I would support. But if we are going to do a development plan here on part of the property, I'm excited about DFI being able to help us with that. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about it at the Affordable Housing Committee today, and this group that's like this consulting firm that comes out of School of Government.
That's the next item on our briefing as well.
That's on our next briefing? That's the next item, okay, for today. Anyway, I'm looking forward to it. But I guess just the point I would say on that, in terms of, because Ferry Road's part of it, downtown's part of it, you know, just looking at the, what I like about what Equinox did was just sort of showing these development footprints on the property. You know, here's your buildable potential, here's areas we recommend, you know, preservation for. I mean, in some ways, the differences in terms of those maps are really not that different between the different scenarios. So, I mean, I hope in some ways, maybe we don't, I mean, I want us to give some high-level direction so that people aren't, you know, we got to start narrowing it down a bit. But once we have DFI, if we do get DFI, I mean, I think they'll be able to help flesh out too, you know, here are different, you know, development opportunities within what y'all agree is you're open to developing. Here's some different things that are possible. I think it'll get just further illuminated as they are able to dig into it too. So I don't want to tie their hands too much in terms of the latitude we would give them to start working with developers on different specific ideas. Other questions or feedback?
Okay, well, Parker, well, one thing that I've heard, and not going the 5 miles out, just going the 1 mile, the 60 residents that's in there, is they want to make sure that the road is going to, you know, there's 3 different scenarios, I guess, of going in at the red light church, acquiring land from Benchmark, and then using existing. I don't think 2 of them will work what they say. And that being in my backyard, I'm hearing from the people that's joining the land is please get a buffer in there that, you know, whatever happens, they know that this land's going to go somewhere. The affordable housing deal, I think, sounds good. Workforce sounds good to them. What they are the most scared of that I've heard is that the county will just say, we're just going to sell the land. And they are scared of apartments and just cramming everything in there. So I'd like commissioners to really think about what the people that's lived there 50, 60 years are thinking about is a buffer and making sure this land is not sold to a developer to do what they want to do with it.
Parker?
I was going to ask a similar question. I think I'm hearing from the same folks Robert is, and I hate to ask Tim a public opinion interpretation question, but I guess that's what I'm going to ask you. When it comes to concerns over infrastructure and the road, did you get a sense of, because I can't tell, did you get a sense of like, are folks concerned about the new road that's going to get built for this purpose that we've kind of talked about the different scenarios? Or are they concerned about, you know, Brevard Road and the interstate and
Sure.
I'm trying to understand how to interpret that.
And, you know, I can't speak for everyone.
Yeah.
I can speak for some that have expressed direct concerns. And so existing infrastructure in the site, there's an old bridge as an example. It's a problem. And so I think there's a concern about that, what happens to that long term. If there's additional density coming, I think there's a desire for new infrastructure. You know, like you can't take these people, these new folks into our community on this existing infrastructure because it's too narrow. You know, there's not enough right-of-way, that type of thing. But then there's this general concern that isn't just here, it's all across town. You know, there's too many cars, traffic's a bear, Interstate 26, that type of thing. So that's how I would describe it.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there, were there any more particular ideas for, besides the idea of like, you don't want to, if you did a more significant development, you don't want to put it all on Ferry Road, you would need the new road. But beyond that, like other specific ideas for how to, you know, address it. I mean, it's too bad when that road was widened that there weren't sidewalks built. I mean, in retrospect, that's easy to see. Wouldn't have cost much more. And, you know, I mean, some of the folks I've heard from in Bent Creek talk about, could you build a sidewalk now, right? It's about a mile from there, kind of back into town, where all the stores and stuff are. I'm sure that wouldn't be cheap. Retrofitting is a lot more expensive than new, but I guess, are there any specific ideas, like, well, here's one idea, and then is it justifiable financially to consider?
Sure. Nothing in the near term. We've certainly talked about this project with DOT to understand what their plans are on Brevard Road, and told them to keep us in mind, but nothing like in the short term to address those concerns. So.
All right, well, other questions for now? This will be to be continued. Any other questions or feedback for now? All right, Tim, thanks for the update. Are you sticking around for the next item too? Yes. Keep going.
All right, so continuing on the path, but this time not on my own. Matt Cable will be joining for this discussion as well. So master planning for county-owned properties. And, we've just engaged in a discussion about the Ferry Road property, which is a planning exercise. And what we realized is, to get to the next steps, to really make this site successful, we needed some outside expertise as well. And then we realized, hey, there's some other goals we're trying to accomplish as well. So we could sort of package all of this together. And so that's what we're here today to talk about, master planning for county-owned properties. So from an overview perspective, and I apologize for those who have heard this already today, but we believe there's a strategic opportunity here through the development of county-owned properties so that we can meet commission's commitments and goals. And those commitments and goals are documented in different places, but one example is the Buncombe 2025 strategic plan, but also our racial equity action plan and our affordable housing goals. And so in those plans, commission has articulated based on community input what's important. As an example, in the vibrant economy goals, we're seeking to implement land use strategies that encourage affordable housing near transportation and jobs. I mean, this is like Ferry Road in a nutshell, right? This is a really important thing. Resident well-being, expand and maintain cultural and recreational assets. Again, thinking about the greenway connectivity that could come through a Ferry Road property. For the Racial Equity Action Plan, or the REAP, improve housing outcomes for the most impacted communities. Improve wellness and recreation outcomes for the most impacted communities. Again, we're seeing, these goals that you've articulated, we could potentially meet some of these through our county-owned property. And finally, last but not least, affordable housing goals, increase the supply of affordable housing. So, we see these county-owned properties as an opportunity to meet commission's goals and ultimately the community's goals. What we're asking for is support to move that forward in the form of a master developer. And so we've identified a partner that can support us and guide us in this process, and so we want to talk about that a little bit today. As a reminder, we will be back on the 19th, and this time it will be a we, because Matt Cable will be with us, but also our potential partner. So that partner is DFI, or the Development Finance Initiative. For those that are not familiar, this is an arm of the UNC School of Government. And so DFI has been around for a long time, doing mixed-use affordable housing projects like ours since at least 2011. And you can see in the map on the bottom left, those little dots symbolize projects they've conducted all across the state. You can see those aren't restricted to the eastern part of the state. There's also projects in the west where geography and topography is a lot different. We also give some stats on the bottom right to give you a sense of the size of their projects and things like that. So they're used to deal with big, small, complicated projects. Since 2011, these are all the projects DFI has worked on. This is a color-coded map, and each of the dots is color-coded based on year. What I'll mention to you, there's a few projects of note. In Western North Carolina, specifically, DFI has worked on projects in Hendersonville, as well as Asheville, Morganton. So they've got some familiarity. Specific examples of those projects you may be familiar with or not. In Asheville, supported the South Slope and RAD redevelopment efforts. In Lenore, the Lenore Mills project, the Broughton Hospital in Morganton, and the Gray Hosiery Mill in Hendersonville. So just a few projects in our backyard that they've worked on. Also done some really big, impressive projects in the Piedmont, Durham in particular, a mixed-use development project. So just examples of the kind of work they've done. From the question of why DFI, 3 buckets to think about here. One is experience, there's the timing, and then the cost efficiencies. From an experience perspective, DFI is really attractive because they work in North Carolina. They're a part of the School of Government. So they're familiar with our statutes, they know our limitations, and because of that, it shortens ramp-up time. We're not gonna have to teach somebody about our rules here. We're not gonna have to teach about tax credits. They'll be able to sort of hit the ground running. In fact, they're viewed as experts in the fields. Over 100 projects across the state and 70 communities here in North Carolina. But also for us, you know, a partner, like someone that can walk side by side with us throughout the process. They have a vested interest in this being a successful project. From a timing perspective, DFI is a unit of government. They're part of the state government, and so it simplifies our procurement process, and so we can bring them in quicker than if we had to go out for an extended RFP process with private development entities. Additionally, DFI, because they've done this work before, they feel in the case of Ferry Road, we could probably get to a solicitation in about 12 months, a year. A little bit longer in the case of the county-owned properties because we're at a different state, but we'll talk about that more. From a cost efficiency standpoint, because we're talking about Ferry Road, but also the quote-unquote downtown properties, there's some economies of scale. And specifically, you know, when DFI starts a project, they like to do what they call a market scan, you know, to understand what the housing needs are in the community, to understand what land use types are scarce and the like. So because we'll only have to do that once, we're saving a good amount of time. Also a good opportunity for us to like really focus on Buncombe for once. We've done a lot of needs assessments across the community. The Bowen Report's a great example of the 16-county dogwood region. This being more focused and more timely to our work right now. A really interesting component of this project is that second bullet, DFI will work at risk. And what this means is that a portion of DFI's fee will never be recouped by DFI unless they're able to secure a development agreement for us. And at that time, that at-risk fee would be paid by the developer. So in that sense, it's a better deal for us if that's what we're looking for, because DFI is willing to put some skin in the game, but also the developers as well. Final point is, you know, having someone that's done this before, sort of walking side by side, we believe we'll be able to trigger the right expertise at the right time. We know we're going to need engineering and architectural experience, surveyors as we proceed down this path, and we believe they'll help us know when the right time is to trigger those asks. So DFI's role kind of at a high level, and Matt and I will kind of go into more detail about how that could differ for the two work streams. But in general, you know, DFI is going to provide pre-development feasibility analysis, and there's some examples there. The first one is site analysis. On the Ferry Road project, we've kind of done a lot of that. You've already seen these concepts. With the downtown properties, that work is yet to be done. Market analysis, affordable housing needs, I've kind of talked about that. Like, what do we need in this community? I think we have a good sense, but like, let's really narrow it down. Like, how much missing middle do we need? Financial feasibility, probably my favorite part. We can put out really ambitious goals, but there is a cost associated with those things, and we need to know what those costs are, eyes wide open as we proceed. So building those pro formas, revising those pro formas, that's a step we need to take in the next phase to understand what we're really talking about. Which gets to the next bullet, which is that public-private partnership modeling. That's a fancy way of saying how much money is the private sector putting in versus how much are we putting in as the public entity, and understanding kind of the trade-offs as those numbers shift. The last two bullets are probably the most important. This is all about getting into a development agreement and bringing developers to the table. A key part of DFI's approach, and you'll get to hear about it when they return on the 19th, is making sure that we're clear as a local government what we expect in the solicitation process from affordability, recreation, whatever it is. What do we want? That way, everyone's competing on those items at the get-go. That way, once everyone is on a level playing field, then we can talk about what are sort of the deal points. What are the additions that make a project go from good to great? And so that's an exciting part of the process, the negotiation. So with that said, we're going to shift quickly into Ferry Road, and then I'll stop talking and invite Matt to take the reins. So for the Ferry Road property on the left, you've seen this picture a million times. I won't talk about it. But the scope of work for DFI, this is a high-level view of what that would be. The cost for the service is $137K. This can be split over 2 fiscal years in order to make the costs a little bit more palatable. Additionally, the period of performance is about 12 months. So seeking to go from start to finish in this master development agreement in about 12 months. Example deliverables, we've talked about those. Next steps, bringing this before the board, y'all, on April 19th for your approval. At that point, we would ask you to approve an allocation of affordable housing services program funds and then direct staff to move into a contract. So that's Ferry Road in a nutshell. But at this point, unless any questions, I'll invite Matt to talk about the downtown properties.
I'll let Tim do all the talking, I think. It's a good choice to go in that order. The downtown properties, if the board will recall, back in December, we brought forward this idea or this concept of taking a look at the properties in the downtown area for feasibility for use for affordable housing. These maps identify kind of 3 key areas on Cox Avenue, Valley Street, and Woodfin Street. There are a lot of caveats with these properties. They're currently, many of them, occupied. So there are a number of factors that would be evaluated in assessing any of these sites for potential affordable housing use, and also how to deal with and address any existing uses on the site. So that would be part of that consideration. But DFI has a phased approach to how they would conduct a feasibility study and ultimately get us to development agreement, which is the ideal scenario as we're moving to actually producing affordable housing at one or more of these sites. There are 2 phases. The first is pre-development and opportunity site identification. So in this phase, they're going to be looking at the parcels that we provide that are county-owned parcels, any sites that we've identified. They're going to look at financial feasibility. Again, they're going to be touching on the market assessment that they're conducting with the Ferry Road project. So that's part of that economies of scale that we're going to realize. And then gauging public interest, which we've done a lot of work in, and we have a lot of feedback already stating that affordable housing as a general goal is supported on that community-wide level. The big key here is the identification of parcels that will be suitable for low-income housing tax credits. So that's the largest non-kind of local subsidy of funds that are out there to produce affordable housing projects. So while site selection wouldn't be limited there, that's going to be kind of that first tier goal, is if we can identify sites that county owned that are eligible for that kind of funding, that is a good benchmark. But they're going to be looking at what kind of funding sources might be appropriate and what sites would be appropriate to utilize those funding sources on. They're also going to be considering how county offices may be incorporated into owned sites. So if they're already on a site, how do we incorporate it? How could that be used elsewhere? And kind of addressing that need, because that's recognized as part of this process. And then ultimately prioritizing the sites of those that we provide and request they evaluate, and prioritize which are the most appropriate for affordable housing and make some site recommendations. So we should ultimately get a list, from highest priority site to least appropriate or useful site for affordable housing. At that point, they'll move into phase 2, which is site-specific pre-development and solicitation of development partners. So from that list, they'll solicit feedback from the county and say, okay, these are the sites you've identified, these are the sites that we agree we would like to advance towards a development agreement, and they'll begin the second phase. And the first part of that is assisting in soliciting public input for the selected sites. So we recognize Ferry Road's kind of gone through this public process, but if we have identified sites, there will definitely necessarily be a public input piece about the specific sites that have been selected. And we'll work with DFI to identify, appropriate processes and also use our arsenal of our tools that we use to solicit public input and solicit that at that point in the process. They will conduct very specific site constraint analysis. They'll prepare the financial models. Again, as Tim has mentioned, that's the real key piece, is they're going to develop the pro formas. And they're doing a lot of the legwork for the developers, which is how they draw the developer in and why the developer is willing to pay them that fee, that at-risk piece that DFI is putting out there. They would, ultimately move us into soliciting the development agreements, to negotiating points of the deal with a developer, getting to those agreements, and then ongoing support until they close the financing. So they will be continuing to support the county through all steps of that process.
Hey, Matt, and this phased approach that you're talking about, is this particular to the downtown properties, or this would apply to all the properties they look at?
So this is particular to that feasibility scope. So the properties that we've identified in the downtown area, right? This is the methodology for, in this case, it's like I said, different from Ferry Road, because phase one is really which properties are we talking about, and then phase two is more similar to what you would be looking at in the Ferry Road process, if that makes sense.
Commissioner, yes, downtown, but any other property that we put on that list that will go through this phased approach?
Including Ferry Road. I mean, Ferry Road, we've already kind of.
We already did
decided
phase one on Ferry Road, so Ferry Road for them is in phase two.
So yeah, Ferry Road, we're already partway through that process.
Right, we already done the public input piece, but they'll be coming, and we done the site constraint, so they'll be coming in now, as Tim had, on Tim's slide, to talk about the financial, the pro formers. That's the piece that they'll be plugging in for us going forward.
And so for this feasibility study, the cost here, so you do see some cost savings in this portion is $83,500. And really what they're not having to duplicate here is that market assessment, that needs assessment piece, which is part of the overall Ferry Road process. So that's where we realize some savings. The period of performance, phase one is estimated to take around 4 months, phase two around 8 months, so it's about a year. And that's the point at which they're really engaging in the development agreement. In this scenario, we're looking at 2 sites. So the period could be 1 to 2 years, 12 to 24 months. If we need to phase when we release and try to move forward on development agreements, we'll come up with a strategy for how to approach 2 separate sites that's going to be the most advantageous for the county through that process. So next steps here, similar to the Ferry Road process, is to allocate the 22 Affordable Housing Services Program funds, which are currently unallocated, and direct staff to move to contract. And this slide just sums up 2 separate asks. I will mention, as Tim has alluded to, we did bring this to the Affordable Housing Committee in full today for them to weigh in on. We'll bring back their recommendation in terms of the allocation of funds from the Affordable Housing Services Program.
And we were very supportive of it. So there'll be a positive recommendation on that. Just go back to the phase one and phase two. I guess part of it, I'm just looking at those lists, and I mean, I agree with like the work that's been done on Ferry Road. Some of these, there's been progress made on some of these areas, but I guess as I'm looking at the phase one and phase two, in some ways there's some things on this list that, even in the phase one, like it might be interesting to hear DFI's take on, like, I mean, like for example, could Ferry Road potentially have a LIHTC project on it? Like, that's the question, right? So I don't think we necessarily know the answer to that yet, but we're saying in phase one, they would look at that for downtown, but I'd like for them to look at that for Ferry Road too, get their input on it. So they could do things like that, right? Even though I don't want them to start from scratch, of course, with all the planning that we've already done. Commissioners, other questions or thoughts on this?
Well, I'm excited that you've brought DFI on. It actually relieves some stress because thinking about us taking on this scope of work that we're getting ready to take on. So I'm thankful. Yes, so thank you to whoever did all that great work and pulled them in. I'm very appreciative.
All right, any other questions or thoughts for now? Well, this will be back on our agenda for the 19th to vote on this. So any other questions for now? All right. Matt, Tim, thanks so much. Great update. Look forward to talking further on the 19th. All right, commissioners, next up, let's talk about the lobbyist item, and then we'll go to the childhood committee update too. So Avril had the staff print out this memo that was circulated over email a couple of days ago, which is a preliminary kind of one-pager on thinking about if the county were to retain a government relations group to represent Buncombe County's interest in the NC legislature, what would be the scope of the work for that group to do? Part of what prompted this is that, I've heard some feedback from some of our legislators that, hey, other counties and cities across the state have lobbyists who represent them in the General Assembly. And, and their view is that they get a lot of value out of that. So I've heard some encouragement that the county consider this as well. The city of Asheville does have a group that represents them as well. So the staff put together this memo that just kind of outlines, here are different public policy areas that obviously we have a lot of interest in and specific goals around. So they could be tasked with keeping their, eyes open for issues related to this, opportunities that might be able to help us advance these goals. And, then the process by which they would be consulting with the commission and our staff to carry out this work. I think the basic idea that I've heard in terms of how most of these folks work is, we would go through a process to select a firm, see who's interested, select a firm, and then we would have a contract. So, this would be I don't think the county's done this before that I'm aware of. Maybe in the distant past we have, but not while I think any of us have been here, if ever. So it would be a contract. We could, of course, monitor it, see how it's going, because obviously there'll be a cost associated with retaining a group. So we could, try this out for a while to get a sense of, are we getting a good value out of this service? And, if so, hopefully continue it. If not, we could, discontinue it. But anyway, it's something I was interested in the commission having some discussion about. The short session is coming up soon, so if we were going to do something, we should probably, take a look at this. Otherwise, the opportunity will be gone for a year. So, in addition to the specific kind of general, I think these general categories that the staff outlined here, those all sound good. There are several specific issues that could be debated in the legislature this year. We've heard ideas around reforming the county hotel tax to increase the percentage of funds that goes to community investments rather than just television advertisements. Right now we're spending like $25 million just on television ads. And there's broad support for shifting those towards more community priorities. So that could be an issue we could ask a group to help advocate for in the legislature this year. One of the things I know the commission's talked about in the past, this is more of a statewide issue. I don't think it's something they could just do for Buncombe County, but we've talked about the idea of expanding the Homestead Exemption Act, which would reduce the property tax burden on senior citizens and other maybe groups within the community that are particularly burdened by property taxes. The state has some policies on that, but they could be expanded. Again, I don't think they can do it for just one county. They'd have to do it for all the counties. But it's something that Buncombe County could advocate for. I think other communities think about these issues as well.
I think, for example, taxing second property homeowners would be, in terms of Airbnbs and that sort of thing, would be huge. Huge source of revenue. That'd be great.
Yeah, so those are just a couple of issues that might come up for discussion where we could have a bit more of a voice if we had someone kind of working on this for us. So any initial, there's no vote on this today. We just kind of wanted to have some discussion about it. But any initial questions or thoughts about this at this time? And I'll ask the staff to also offer, anything else you would add about this idea at this time that I didn't touch on?
No, so this is just our scope of work, so we would want to get some direction around, do we release an RFP and select someone to bring forward for the board to contract with? Those specific items that you raised, we want to see those in the contract, but broad conversations for the scope and then more narrow focus when we go to the contract phase, if the board directs that way.
And do we have some sense of the cost of this to retain someone? Do we have a general ballpark?
I believe we've seen some, and I'll ask Don because he did some of the research. Don, did you have any ideas of the cost that we've seen across the state on lobbyists? Okay. So we don't have a cost at this point. Other communities have them, and they're full-year contracts, usually in the range of 90 or so thousand.
I'll just say briefly that I'm very excited about us moving forward. I think this has been kind of in the works for a few years and excited about us doing it and opportunities to accelerate the timeline on it if they exist.
Any other initial thoughts? All right, well, if you do, feel free to let Avril and I know. And again, if we are gonna do this, we probably should do an RFP soon to kind of get some specific proposals in front of us so we can have more specific proposals to react to. I think, the different firms are gonna have different rates, so we can kind of see who's out there that would be interested in representing Buncombe County, what they charge. Does anybody object to the idea of us going through a process to do an RFP and see who responds, so we have something more specific to react to?
Yes,
All right.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and do that, and that doesn't commit us to anything, but it sounds like there's interest in looking at that, so we could have a specific proposal to consider. All right, thank you, Avril. And the last item is discussion or update from the Early Childhood Education Committee.
Yeah, just a brief update, and Al and Robert join in if you want, but just wanted to share that the Early Childhood Education Committee began our discussions about the grant applications we received this year. We received 24, really incredible group of applications, and are on track to have recommendations to the county manager's office by April 30th. The committee also took an action step today in unanimously passing a endorsement of the commission, us, fully funding the pre-K strategies that the committee had previously endorsed. So what came to us previously was an endorsement of strategies. What comes to us now, as the committee sinks its teeth into funding, is endorsement of the commission fully funding the pre-K expansion strategies that have been proposed. So just wanted to share that breaking news from our Early Childhood Committee.
Cool.
More to come soon.
All right, thanks, Jasmine. All right, that covers everything on our agenda, so let's adjourn, and we will reconvene at 5 o'clock for the regular meeting.